Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of my reaction to Atun-Shei Films' latest episode in his series on Checkmate, Lincolnites, which is his attempt to refute many of the lost cause narratives that are out there about the nature and cause and actual events of the American Civil War from a Southern perspective. If you didn't see part 1 of my reaction, I'll put a link in the description that'll take you back to that so you can get caught up before you come into part 2. I don't know if we'll get through all of this today or not. We got through about 19 minutes of it last time, and we're picking up where we left off. There's still about 35 minutes to go. A bunch of you warned me that the ending's a little different, so we'll see what happens if we get that far, but let's go ahead and dive right in.
Well, that sounds nice. The devil comes in a pleasing shape. Calhoun's theory of government came to be almost exclusively concerned with furthering Southern slaveholder interests. And as these ideas gained traction, Virginian lawyers Abel Upshur and Beverly Tucker wrote influential polemics, bringing rights of property and slaves to the very center of Jeffersonian constitutional thought. What emerged from this ideological confluence of the 1820s South was a political platform that came to be broadly known as Southern rights. Many of its principles would go on to be foundational tenets of the Confederate worldview. Here's my holdup with this narrative of yours, and I mean this sincerely. The Declaration of Independence gives us the right to pursue our own happiness, free from government interference. Yes, slavery was evil.
Now here's the problem. People like to quote the Declaration of Independence regularly, and that's great. The Declaration of Independence is a brilliant document. Thomas Jefferson, for all his many faults, and I am not a fan of Thomas Jefferson, I will give him all the credit in the world for that because it was brilliantly written and it expressed things perfectly. However, it is not a legal document, okay, for the purposes of our existence today. That's the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence was simply an expression of the reasons why we were declaring independence from the mother country. Has no bearing whatsoever on the laws of this country today.
But there's another principle involved here, is there not? Give the government an inch on one issue and they'll take a mile on another one. Next thing you know, you're getting groped by rent-a-cops at the airport. Therefore, I would argue that states' rights were a crucial component of the checks and balances of power. Rights stamped out under the boot heels of a million Yankee soldiers. And our country is lesser for it. Well, I would argue that within the philosophy of Southern rights, individual and state rights always took a back seat to economic advantage and political power.
And that's another really good point, is that people will use whatever argument gets them where they want to go. So, for example, the argument of states' rights works because they wanted the right to own slaves. But the minute you go and tell Illinois, well, you don't have the right to declare that slaves who enter your territory are now free, and you want the federal government to step in and force Illinois to send your slaves back under the Fugitive Slave Act, pretty soon you realize, well, states' rights only gets me as far as I want it to go. Same thing happened in the American Civil War, where Jefferson Davis found himself lamenting that he didn't have some of the same power Abraham Lincoln did, because there were a lot of things he wasn't able to do, where he found himself wishing for a stronger central government for the Confederacy, the very thing they were fighting against in the first place. So, it really, I think the argument he's making here is that it's really about getting what you want. It's not so much as one might think about principle.
What you would describe as a conflict between Northern authoritarianism and Southern libertarianism, I would describe as a struggle between two competing concepts of American nationhood. Slave owners became convinced that the best security for their fortunes and property was to enshrine manifestly pro-slavery legislation into national law. The Constitution had become extremely accommodating of the slave system, but maddeningly, it lacked an explicit and concrete endorsement of human bondage,
which they tried to get.
Southern rights advocates spent much of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s attempting to correct that mistake. Aha! But what about the proposed Corwin Amendment in the winter of '61, just before the war? Lincoln offered the South the explicit constitutional protection for slavery that you say they were looking for, and yet we still seceded, proving it was about states' rights after all. We already talked about the Corwin Amendment. We did? Yeah, way back in episode 1. So you mentioned the Corwin Amendment. I'm glad you did. That was basically the federal government's last-ditch attempt to avoid the Civil War. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Corwin Amendment was this proposed amendment to the Constitution that basically would have guaranteed the southern states right to own slaves. I mean, potentially forever. So your implication would be that if the war was really about slavery, then why didn't the southern states just immediately go along with and ratify the Corwin Amendment? But you're forgetting that a big cause of the Civil War, and certainly the events leading up to the Civil War, were not about preserving slavery, but expanding it. I mean, you take the Missouri Compromise, for instance.
Excellent point, because nobody was threatening to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln did not run on that platform. He was very explicit in stating that he only opposed the expansion of slavery. But that was enough for the southern states to understand that ending the expansion of slavery was the first step toward the eventual extermination of slavery. And so, yeah, he's right. It wasn't enough.
Wow. So young. So full of hope. Long time ago. Yeah. More than 3 years now. Yeah, wow. So adding to the point made in the clip, the Corwin Amendment would have prohibited the federal government from interfering in the, quote, domestic institutions of the states. Specifically, and here it parrots the vague language that the framers used back in 1787, persons held to service. Confederates rejected the Corwin Amendment outright. To them, it was completely inadequate. As you said, it only protected slavery in the states where it existed in 1861. Confederates would settle for nothing less than the proposed Crittenden Compromise of 1860, which would have explicitly recognized African slavery, and it uses those exact words, as legitimate and constitutional, and completely immune from federal interference below the 3630 parallel established in the Missouri Compromise. And that would have included territorial gains made in Central and South America.
And again, that, you know, if you look at a lot of the alternate history scenarios in which the South wins the Civil War, almost all of them include an eventual Southern incursion into Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, looking for new places to expand slavery. Because that was always a big part of it. To keep the economy going and to keep the value of their slaves going is to expand the demand into new places. And yeah, the idea of popular sovereignty, which had come about in the 1850s and which led to things like the Kansas, the basically bleeding Kansas, as they call it, where people fought over whether Kansas would be free or slave. They didn't even want that. They just wanted it to be pretty much guaranteed that Southern states, new Southern states, as they expanded west as part of Manifest Destiny, were absolutely going to be slave states.
Something the planter class salivated over often enough. It's a big reason most of them supported the Mexican War. But there was no way that Lincoln and the Republicans could accept that. I mean, that would have been giving the South the exact same thing that they wanted from the very beginning, which was a legally binding admission that America was fundamentally a pro-slavery nation. Back up now. You still haven't given me any proof that Southerners abused federal power for their own purposes. Holy fucking shit, dude. Why don't we start with the Indian Removal Act? In the 1820s, forcible displacement of Native Americans from the southeastern U.S. was broadly popular among white Southerners, especially in Georgia, which had passed legislation outlawing the Cherokee tribal government and declaring its dominion over Cherokee land. Complementing this state resolution with federal action, Georgia Congressman Wilson Lumpkin introduced a proposal for Indian removal to the House of Representatives.
And by the way, if you aren't already familiar with this, when you see those little numbers pop up, he actually has a lot of his, a lot of the stuff that he is quoting and referring to is in his description of his video as references that you can go and look at for yourself, which I think is a nice touch.
Later in life, Lumpkin recalled how he was stymied at first by Northern humanitarian efforts.
I had in view relieving my own state from the encumbrance of our Indian population, but we still found many serious obstacles in the way over and above the zealous opposition of our open and determined opponents in both House and
Darn Congress.
Moreover, during the recess of Congress, the Northern fanatics, male and female, gone to work and gotten up thousands of petitions, signed by more than 1 million of men, women, and children, protecting against the removal of the poor, dear legislature. In these petitions we were denounced as slaveholders.
Oh, that's right. The saintly North and the horrible evil South.
Back to his whataboutism. Well, yeah, maybe we did some bad things in the South, but the North's not any better.
Tell me, who are these Yankees taking such a strong, principled stance against Indian removal?
Well, there was President John Quincy Adams, for one.
Yeah.
Oh, from Massachusetts, is that right?
From Braintree, yeah.
Massachusetts, interesting name for a state. Is that named after some place in England? Is there a quaint little village in Suffolk named Massachusetts?
Named after natives.
No.
Really? Well, that is interesting. And where, pray tell, does the name originate?
The Massachusetts people, who lived there for thousands of years before we did.
Oh, and what happened to them?
Well, we took over all their good farmland, and that kind of forced them to convert to Christianity and assimilate with us. And then we got really paranoid that they were going to turn on us, so we,
Yes?
So we rounded them all up and put them in this internment camp on this crappy little island in Boston Harbor in the middle of winter. Okay, yeah. Northern opposition to Indian removal was incredibly hypocritical. But
Okay, yeah, but let's understand that we're talking about the 1600s versus the 1800s, and he's absolutely right. There's no defending what was done to Native Americans in the early days, except to point out the fact that a lot of those same Native Americans would have just as easily done that to other Native Americans and had done so. So, you know, I'm not going to defend it, but I'm also not going to make it sound like the poor defenseless natives never would have done anything like that, because they did the same kind of stuff to each other, too. Everybody has blood on their hands at that time. Just a heads up, I had to pause there for a second. You may hear noises in the background. It is summer, and I have 3 kids, 2 teenagers, and one who's 9 years old and has a bunch of 8, 9, 10-year-old friends, all of whom are very loud in our neighborhood. So we're running a professional operation here, but I can't control the sounds of screaming children outside. So apologies in advance if you hear that. Let's move on.
sincerely felt.
Oh, I'm sure they offered up many thoughts and prayers.
The Cherokee were able to keep Georgia legally at bay with the help of some, yes, admittedly fairly flaccid support from the Adams administration. But then 2 things happened. First, gold was discovered in the mountains of North Georgia, making white settlement efforts much more urgent.
Which is interesting because the exact same thing will happen in the 1870s when the government signs this agreement with the northern Native Americans, like the Lakota, and gives them the Black Hills, and then gold gets discovered in the Black Hills by people who aren't even supposed to be there. And then suddenly the government kind of says, okay, well, maybe we want the Black Hills after all, and that leads to the Great Sioux War. That's the one in 1876 where George Armstrong Custer and elements of his 7th Cavalry will be wiped out. So a common theme is making agreements with Native Americans until you find a reason that you want the land you just agreed to give them.
And second, Adams was defeated and succeeded as president
Andrew
by
Jackson.
Governor Andrew Jackson, who staunchly supported removal and thought that Cherokee claims of self-sovereignty were inherently illegitimate.
Yeah, in fact, when the Cherokee were a civilized tribe. In other words, they dressed like white people. They had government. They did all the things that, like, picture in your mind Native Americans on the plains in the 1860s and 70s. That was not the Cherokee at all. Very different culture. And they had sovereignty in that area, and the Supreme Court actually supported them in that. And then Jackson was basically like, well, they made their ruling, now let's see them enforce it, and then completely ignored the Supreme Court. You can't have checks and balances if one branch of the government is just going to completely ignore the checks and balance system.
I have long viewed treaties with the Indians an absurdity, not to be reconciled to the principles of our government. The Indians are the subjects of the United States, inhabiting its territory. Is it not absurd for the sovereign to negotiate by treaty with the subject?
When Jacksonians spoke of rights for citizens, they had a very specific idea of what kind of person that citizen was. A white man. Jackson's populism replaced class lines with racial and gendered ones. Jackson, and the white South more broadly, saw no place for Native Americans in the white man's republic.
That said, I think a lot of people in the North saw citizenship as white men too. I don't know that there was a lot of difference in that. Even if people disagreed on the treatment of natives, disagreed on the treatment of African Americans, I think you would have found a lot of people in the North not really willing. I mean, if you watch the movie Lincoln, you see a lot of that debate played out, where you have a lot of people who were on the fence about the anti-slavery amendment that would have banned slavery, because they were afraid that ending slavery was the first step toward giving black people citizenship and the right to vote. And while many of them were okay with freeing slaves, a lot of those same people weren't okay with those next steps.
Natives living east of the Mississippi were an obstacle to white civilizational progress. The liberty and prosperity of the one necessitated the expulsion of the other. In an 1830 address to Congress, 6 months after signing the Indian Removal Act into law, President Jackson boasted that,
"It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of our government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements, is approaching to a happy consummation."
Happy for who?
Man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute.
I love how he's spinning this as any good person is going to prefer the United States with our cities and towns and civilization to roaming the countryside and, savages. I mean, that's basically what he's saying here is, no real civilized human being would prefer living like the Native Americans when we have this benevolent system to offer them.
Occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion.
Jackson's presidency was in many ways a realization of Southern rights nationhood. A powerful, decisive executive in external affairs, but highly deferential to slaveholder interests in internal ones. And most importantly, a staunch defender of the white supremacist social order.
In your eagerness to blame white people in every video you make, you're forgetting about the nullification crisis. Wait, I just had the most profound sense of deja vu.
Also talked about this before.
To blame white people in every video you make, you've forgotten about the nullification crisis.
Man, we must really be running low on comments over recycling shit from episode 3.
Well, these are complex, nuanced topics, and they're not gonna...
Oh, I know.
They just don't have the,
Yeah. Anyway, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, John C. Calhoun nearly led South Carolina to secession over a states' rights issue during Jackson's presidency. The rights of South Carolina to nullify the tariff we previously discussed. Jackson wasn't obsequious to planter class interests then. In fact, he was maneuvering troops for a potential invasion. Sounds positively Lincolnian, sir.
If Louisiana had tried to secede from the Confederate states during the Civil War, do you think Jefferson Davis would have let that happen?
No, not if he was in any position to stop it, but that was wartime. The circumstances...
Absolutely true. And like I said earlier, Jefferson Davis found himself lamenting not having the ability to exercise his executive authority the way Lincoln did. And he ended up in a bunch of clashes with Southern governors who wouldn't send him troops, for example, and wanted to fight for states' rights. So it's all about convenience, and you support states' rights when it supports the cause that means something to you, and when it's in the way, suddenly it doesn't matter so much. And that's, I think, the point he's making about Andrew Jackson.
This would have been different. What's your point?
My point is that there's more than one kind of union, and all sorts of different kinds of flavor of unionist. Jackson's joust with Calhoun was a squabble between two different strains of Southern rights nationalism. Similarly, Confederates would disagree about how far the states' rights principle went, And we'll get more into this later, but even most of them would agree that you can't just let the states do whatever, right? At a certain point, the central government has to put its foot down. South Carolina's secession would have jeopardized the security of the nation. So yeah, Jackson fiercely opposed it. In fact, you could argue that in threatening to secede, South Carolina became just the sort of external threat to white nationhood that Jackson habitually crushed. Why should the tranquility of white men in North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, or anywhere else be disturbed just because of the caprice of South Carolina? And in any event, in all other aspects of his presidency, Jackson sanctified the rights of slave states and slaveholders. The truly grave threats to the Union, he believed, were up north. He placed the blame for sectional politics squarely on the shoulders of abolitionists.
Wait, really?
The abolitionist movement really started to gain traction in the 1830s.
Yep.
And what's more, they began to organize, to form...
And, think about what's happening in the world at that time. The 1830s is when the British Empire finally abolishes slavery throughout the empire. They had abolished the slave trade actually pretty close to about the same time that the United States abolished the slave trade. And in fact, the British and U.S. navies, who had previously fought each other, and it was over naval issues that the War of 1812 breaks out, actually patrolled the coasts of Africa together in helping to try and stop the slave trade. And so, yeah, in the 1830s, the British Empire abolishes slavery. It's about that time you start to see abolition become very, very powerful in terms of their political outspokenness in the United States.
Form community networks and publish mass media. These guys were the most radical of the radical, and a very motley crew. Whites, blacks, men, women, some women in positions of leadership.
I definitely would have been an abolitionist if I was alive back then.
Shut up. The mere existence of these organizations challenged the legitimacy of the white man's republic, and they could be very disruptive. In the summer of 1835, abolitionists flooded the Southern mails with radical literature, causing a huge uproar and widespread panic of black rebellion. Slave states quickly passed laws ordering local postal workers to take the incendiary mail out of circulation, and thousands of
Censorship
pamphlets were confiscated and burned.
Well, that doesn't seem great, free speech-wise. Burning books and such.
True to form, Jacksonian central government came swiftly to the defense of the slave system against this external threat from women, blacks, and race traders. The president threw full federal support behind the local ordinances, arguing that the states had every right to preserve order however they saw fit. He praised Northern Democrats for speaking out against the radicals, telling Congress that
it is fortunate for the country that the good sense and the deep-rooted attachment of the people of the non-slaveholding states to the Union and to their fellow citizens of the same blood in the South have given so strong and impressive a tone to the sentiments entertained against the proceedings of the misguided persons who have engaged in these unconstitutional and wicked attempts.
Did you catch that? Fellow citizens of the same blood?
Oh, dang.
All this to say that this was Jackson's greatest contribution to the Confederate worldview. Within the in-group, people with penises and without melanin, individual liberty was absolute and irrevocable. But those liberties did not, under any circumstances, extend to the out-group. Against blacks, natives, and politically active women.
But again, I would argue that that was a viewpoint that was shared by a lot of people in the North. It wasn't quite as universal in the North as it was in the South. And most of where you see those people coming from, the people that are speaking out like abolitionists, that is happening in the North. That doesn't mean that everybody in the North felt that way and that it was a clear North-South divide. The North was split on those issues.
Central government was free to deploy a terrifying range of authoritarian powers with total impunity.
Well, that settles it. This episode is officially bumming me out.
Which brings us to the high watermark of pro-slavery ideology, the Fugitive Slave Law.
Yep.
Wasn't there already a
Total
fugitive
hypocrisy.
slave clause in the Constitution?
There was. But this was the other one.
Ah, yes, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793.
No. The other one. The South's key provision in the Compromise of 1850, which broadened the scope of previous fugitive slave laws. First, by denying suspected runaways the right to a fair trial, so in practice, the government could just black bag and enslave any black person and get away with it. And second, by stipulating that if white citizens failed to adequately assist slave catchers in their inquiries, or aid runaways in any way, they would be slapped with a ruinous fine and face imprisonment.
Tough break.
Abolitionists were outraged and promised slave catchers that any attempt they made to enforce the law in their communities would be met with powder and shot. Free blacks began to plan a mass emigration to West Africa or Central America, citing the Mayflower Pilgrims as their precedent. The Dred Scott decision in 1857, which enshrined into law the idea that black people are ineligible for American citizenship by virtue of their race, simply confirmed what most blacks already knew.
And if you're not already familiar with this, the colony of Liberia was set up in Western Africa as a place for the resettlement of black people who didn't want to stay in the country so that they could get away from all of this situation that was going down. It was the capital was Monrovia, named after James Monroe. And you can even see the flag of Liberia today and the influence it has for the United States flag. There were a lot of people who felt that was the best thing for people, that there would never be equality between black and white. And the best thing that could happen for them would be to get them off the continent as quickly as possible. This is the 1850s is where you have a series of pretty weak executives as far as presidents go, who are just kicking the can down the road and just looking for any easy way out of the situation. This is where you get people like James Buchanan, Franklin Pierce, who are Northerners as president, but Northerners who basically act on behalf of the South when it comes to their interests.
Not citizens, but subjects, like what Andrew Jackson said about the Indians.
Pre-frickin-cisely. Northern whites, for their part, looked on in mounting horror as a reactionary political bloc of slave masters dragged the country back into the 17th century, in sharp contrast to the hemispheric trend of modernization and emancipation. So, they made their voices heard at the polls. They flocked to the nascent Republican Party and elected Abraham Lincoln president of the United States.
So the Republican Party is formed in the 1850s. There had been the main opposition in previous decades to the Democrats. By this point, they're called the Democrats. Before that, the Democratic Republicans, which were born out of the Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson and the like. The Whigs have fallen apart by this time, and the Republican Party is formed in the aftermath of that. And it's kind of this amalgamation of abolitionists, but also people who oppose the expansion of slavery, which Abraham Lincoln would be in that latter category. They run their first national ticket in 1856. It's John C. Fremont, who loses, and it's only possible for them to win in 1860, in large part because of a split among Democrats, and then there's a constitutional union ticket, or I think it was called the maybe union ticket. I forget what it was, but John Bell was the candidate. You could make the argument Lincoln would have won anyway based on the way the voting went, but it's hard to say for sure.
And that, as they say, was that. Not quite. There's still one more piece of this puzzle left. Remember back in episode 5 when I went on that whole tangent about industrial slavery? In their public discourse, speeches, editorials, and pamphlets, the planter class placed much less importance on their Jeffersonian agrarian ideals and much more on them gaining economic independence from the North through internal industrialization. And they believed the best way to do this was through the directive of the state, not private interests. As we've talked about before, the Confederacy was way more centralized than most people give it credit for, and there's ample evidence to suggest that in the event of a Southern victory, the central Confederate government would have become even stronger as it directed private interests to create economic and industrial power that would effectively compete with that of the North. Yes. When the South seceded in the winter of '61, the planter class marveled at all the opportunities that lay before them. For the first time since 1787, they had no compromises to make, no bleeding heart Northerners holding them back, so they looked to the future and their imaginations ran wild with possibilities.
A minority faction, led by former Governor of Virginia Henry Wise, briefly flirted with the idea of an armed coup d'etat in Washington, preventing Lincoln from taking power, but most Confederates envisioned a process of separation and expansion. First, winning independence from the United States by force, and then eclipsing it as a continent-spanning world power.
Yep.
Their first order of business was to organize a reconfederation of the states, to weld them together while they are hot, in the words of politician William Henry Trescott. This was accomplished quickly ahead of the Confederate Constitutional Convention in Montgomery in February of 1861. The new Constitution saw a retreat from states' rights doctrine and a noticeable shift toward the centralization of power, specifically in regard to things like taxation, territorial policy, and of course, the rights of slaveholders. The most vocal of the centralizers advocated for the nationalization of slavery. States' rights doctrine, they believed, had served its purpose.
Right, so let's say for a minute that in the Confederacy, Virginia had wanted to say, we don't want slaves anymore. Wouldn't have been allowed. That state's right to not have slavery would have been just as no-no as what the Confederacy saw as the Union telling them they couldn't have slaves. So, right out the door, he's absolutely 100% right about that.
In achieving separation from the anti-slavery North. Now, to ensure their security and continuing stability, the Southern Republic should be reorganized into the first American slave empire.
He's quoting Star Wars.
That in the new order of things, which is to be inaugurated after the declaration of peace, which will assuredly come, we may find it to our advantage to lay this venerable doctrine of states' rights on the shelf.
So again, it's not about principle. It's about getting what I want, and I want my slaves. And if I have to use states' rights or any other issue to argue that, that's what I'm going to do.
Let us adopt a stable and centralized system, adjusted to preserve the personal respect of every citizen and free from the fluctuations of popular caprice.
Oh, please. That was an outline opinion, not representative of the South as a whole. It was at first, but for the rest of the Confederacy's short life, the clamor for centralization would only increase.
Yep.
What's more, its leading proponents were explicitly anti-democratic. During the war, the exigencies of the United States Army invasion caused many to warm to the authoritarian ideas of Virginian George Fitzhugh, who had long maintained that
it would have been well for us if the seemingly pompous inanities of the Declaration of Independence, of the Virginia Bill of Rights, and the Act of Religious Toleration had remained dead letters. Their charlatanic, half-learned, pedantic authors believed that all men are created equal. This is an infidel doctrine.
hot damn. He continues.
We come now to the Southern Revolution of 1861, which we maintain was reactionary and conservative, a rolling back of the excesses of the Reformation, of Reformation run mad, a solemn protest against the doctrines of natural liberty, human equality, and the social contract as taught by Locke and the American sages of 1776, and an equally solemn protest against the doctrines of Adam Smith, Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine, and the rest of the infidel political economists who maintained that the world is too much governed.
Holy shit. Yeah, it's sinister as fuck, dude. And by late 1863, when Fitzhugh wrote those words, there were more than enough white Southerners advocating for authoritarianism, or even monarchy, to constitute a serious threat to the Republic's long-term stability. And this horrified more moderate Confederates, as Augusta Jane Evans explained.
My countrymen have lost their former firm faith in democratic republicanism. I am pained and astonished to consider how many are now willing to glide unhesitatingly into a dictatorship, a military
Didn't take long.
despotism.
But even the most pro-democracy Confederates were stuck in the mire of their own racism. The Confederate intelligentsia proffered bizarre and feverish theories of a patrician republic where planters of royal Norman stock dominated inferior Scotch, Irish, and Anglo-Saxon whites to nearly the same extent they dominated black slaves. This is a lot to process. When Jefferson Davis presented his pleas for official state recognition to the governments of France and Britain, he portrayed the Confederacy as a state which simply wanted to be left alone.
Yep.
He was lying through his teeth. The vision of Confederate nationalism, championed by Vice President Alexander Stephens and parroted by many others, imagined a future of global influence in which the Confederacy exported God-ordained ideas of racial apartheid to the rest of the civilized world. And speaking of God, after secession, Southern Protestant clergy jumped at the chance to add theocracy to the clean slate of their new government. South Carolina's leading minister, James Henry Thornwell, spent much of the war trying to batter down the wall between church and state.
This new confederacy has already, to some extent, rectified the error of the old Constitution, but not so distinctly and clearly as the Christian people of these states desire to see done. We venture respectfully to suggest that it is not enough for a state which enjoys the light of divine revelation to acknowledge in general terms the supremacy of God. It must also acknowledge the supremacy of his Son, whom he hath appointed heir to all things, by whom also he made the worlds. To Jesus Christ, all power in heaven and earth is committed.
Now, I will say this about these speeches and these editorials and things that he's pulling out. They make his argument, but they don't necessarily reflect a prevailing view. In other words, just because James Henry Thornwell felt this way, it doesn't mean that the majority of people in positions of power in the Confederacy felt that way. Doesn't mean they didn't feel that way, but I would be very careful at pulling speeches out by people who were not in charge to make the argument that that was where that government was headed.
To him every knee shall bow.
There's overwhelming evidence to suggest that the Confederacy was well on its way to becoming an autocracy. By the end of the Civil War, the Confederate worldview had drifted so far from the original intent of states' rights doctrine that it's hard to believe the two ideologies were ever once interrelated at all. And the idea that the Confederate States of America had, in any sense, a libertarian form of government is, frankly, laughable.
Uh-oh. Oh boy. This must be the part everybody was talking about that gets a little weird.
What the hell was that? According to the news, there was just an earthquake in Virginia.
Good evening. This is Matt Beat.
Mr. Beat, what?
Here in Monticello in Virginia.
Matt, what are you
We
doing?
can now confirm that the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson,
Rolled over in his grave.
has rolled over in his grave with enough force to trigger an enormous earthquake.
Oh, Jesus.
That's fantastic.
As you can see,
That's awesome,
Northern
Matt.
Virginia is completely destroyed.
My man.
The death toll is catastrophic. Those who do remain have reverted to a primal state of nature. We have learned that what precipitated this massive earthquake was a reading of a historical quote in a production of a wildly unpopular web series known as Checkmate Lincolnites.
Oh, someone's calling. Ew, 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 ew. It's a 202 number. Why don't you take it? Hello?
Hey, is this, Jerry? Not Jerry, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank?
Yes?
Hey, man, it's Joe. President Joey Biden.
Oh, my God. Hello, Mr. President. What an honor. Kiss ass.
Oh, thanks, man. Likewise. Listen, I'm calling to ask that maybe you don't quote any more of those shockingly authoritarian Confederate guys. Monticello was bad enough. We don't want Mount Vernon to blow too.
Yes, of course, Mr. President. I'm so sorry. It won't happen again.
All right, man. That's awesome, pal. That's good to hear, dude. Because, it's kind of a big deal. Well, with the millions of people dying and everything, so I appreciate it, man.
Okay, great. Well, listen, Mr. President, while I have you, we've been sitting here for, I don't even know how long, talking about how the U.S. government was deeply complicit with the antebellum plantation class in the practice of slavery. And, while you were campaigning, you mentioned that you might try to get the ball rolling on federal reparations for slavery. So I was just wondering what the progress was on that so far.
I couldn't be silent for that long. How long is he going to go with this? And then he hangs up.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
All right, so I know there's more to this than that, but the rest of it doesn't have to do with the topic that we're discussing. So I'm going to wrap it up right there. Let me know your thoughts about all of that. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again tomorrow with another reaction video. Thanks for watching.